The question on everybody's mind going into the summer break: how did McLaren go from a papaya tractor to a consistent podium challenger in the span of just a couple of races? It's fairly uncommon to see mid-season upgrade packages bring a lot of performance, but in the case of McLaren, since Austria, their changes seem to have delivered performance in a very serious way. Not only has their qualifying pace substantially improved, but also their race performances have also completely turned around. Today, I'm going to use some of my favorite data analysis techniques to help show you what the performance evolution of the McLaren MCL60 actually looks like. But before we understand the improvements, we actually need to understand what made the car so weak in the first place. Let's put the whole thing in context first. No one would say the 2022 McLaren MCL36 was a great car. We all know that Ricciardo struggled with this car last season, but Lando Norris's average finishing position was about P8, which is not where a team like McLaren aspire to be. But this year's MCL60 started off as an absolute mess. If you thought last year was bad, prior to Austria this season, McLaren had an average finishing position of P13. Even Ricciardo's average finishing position last year was P12. So it clearly went from bad to worse, but what happened? Now I want to get straight into the geeky data stuff, so here's the short version and we'll elaborate on these problems as we go. McLaren's first issue this season is their drag level or their overall car efficiency, and that has to do with something the FIA changed for the rules late last season. These changes, for whatever reason, resulted in McLaren having a reasonable amount of downforce on their car, but they just had too much drag to be competitive. Despite having reasonable high-speed cornering performance, McLaren have struggled massively with overtaking and defending, especially in straight line in races as a result of this. Now, the second big issue is the car's handling characteristics, which is a continuation of what they were dealing with last season and potentially even before that. From what we can gather, the car has poor entry stability and poor front grip at the apex. As far as the stability issues go, there's always ways the driver can deal with this, but it doesn't make the car any faster. It just makes the problems less pronounced and the car is a little bit more predictable, but it's slow. But we'll talk a lot more about the handling characteristics in a minute, and let's get back into the data. So here's McLaren's qualifying performance relative to pole this season up until Canada. This chart is in terms of gaps to fastest lap in terms of percent, so Red Bull are the benchmark so far this season at almost every race. McLaren started off the season struggling with consistency a bit, but they were about 1.5% off, and that's basically tractor territory or a really slow car. And basically anything outside of 0.5% doesn't stand much of a shot of competing for a podium without an act of God. And even at this stage, Mercedes, Aston, and Ferrari were floating around the 0.5% off of pole. They really didn't have a chance against the Red Bulls for the top step of the podium, but they could fight for P2 and P3. But what does 1.5% of performance look like? What are the characteristics which made the McLaren such a slow car? So let's start with Bahrain and try to see what McLaren started the season with and try to understand a little bit about their performance characteristics. And in doing so, we can kind of build up a method to help describe and characterize the rest of the season. Now, if any of the stuff I'm showing you is a little bit too much information at one time, feel free to pause the video or even rewind for a second. So let's start off with a little bit of telemetry basics, and this will form the basis for the rest of the analysis. Here's a telemetry comparison in qualifying in Bahrain between Verstappen's fastest lap in qualifying and Norris's fastest lap in qualifying. And keep in mind, Verstappen got to Q3 on pole and Norris was knocked out in Q2. So there's a couple tenths of track evolution, but for the purpose of this analysis, I think this is fair to compare. So here are the basics of this telemetry. We've got the car speed at the top. We have the throttle trace. You can see the throttle on and off. Here's the DRS, here's the DRS active, here's the DRS inactive, and at the bottom is the lap time delta between the two drivers. In this instance, the further the line goes towards the top, the further ahead in the lap that Verstappen is. And at the top of this chart, I've numbered all the corners and sections. So here's the start of the lap, and here's the end of the lap. And when I'm doing telemetry analysis, I like to do this by grouping together corner speed ranges that are similar and separating those from straight lines to help build up a picture first. So let's start off with straight line performance. And the first thing I noticed is the Red Bull and Verstappen are just so much faster in a straight line. You can see their car speeds are a couple kilometers an hour faster on every straight. And then if you look at the time delta, you can see that Verstappen is gaining time through all of the straight line segments. Next, let's look at all the high speed corners. And I usually associate these with corners that are over 200 kilometers an hour for their apex speed. So for Bahrain in qualifying, that's really just turns 6 and 7. And to be fair, McLaren are pretty good in terms of high-speed performance. Their cornering speeds are similar, and they're not really losing any time through this section. In reality, turn 12 is also a high-speed corner, but in qualifying, it's flat. Next up are the medium-speed corners, and these are corners between 100 and 200 kilometers an hour, and these are pretty difficult for McLaren right now. In turn 4, Norris struggles to carry any sort of speed on the entry, but he does manage to get a reasonable exit from this corner. And then turn 11 and 13, those medium speed corners are pretty poor for the McLaren. You can see Lando carries a lot of speed on the entry, but he's got a very slow apex speed, and then he also struggles to get on the power, and then the same goes for turn 14 into turn 15 here. Now, the low speed corners are the corners below 100 kilometers an hour in terms of their apex speed, and these are kind of the same feeling to me as their medium speed cornering performance. Norris can carry a bit of speed into the corner. The apex speeds aren't as bad. We can look at turn 1, 2, turn 8, and turn 10. But again, he just struggles to get on the power in these corners. So a very similar story to the low speed and medium speed corners. And on these low speed corners, if you struggle to carry apex speed, you just lose all that time even further down the next straight. Now, that whole analysis that we just did took quite a bit of time just to describe the characteristics. So I've gone away and written some code to help do this for the rest of the season. And this approach will let us quickly have a look at how McLaren's performance has evolved throughout the season and what they've learned about their car. Now, I'm not going to pick apart every single event particularly, but I'm going to explain how this process works. So what I've done is I've taken the fastest McLaren and the fastest Red Bull for every qualifying session so far and compared them. Now, this isn't perfect, as sometimes the McLaren might have gotten knocked out in Q1, but over a whole season, it will give us a rough idea, as the Red Bull has been fairly consistent in terms of their qualifying performance. Now, like I did for the analysis in Bahrain, I break the circuit down into straight line sections, high speed sections here, medium speed sections, and low speed sections. And then in each high speed, medium speed, and low speed, I break these down into entry, apex, and exit. If McLaren's faster, the blocks will be blue. And if Red Bull's faster, the blocks will be red. So let's look at the performance profiles up until Canada before McLaren brought their big upgrades and see what we can understand about the performance of the car. Now, the first thing you'll notice is some blocks are missing, and that's because these circuits don't have corners that fall into the bins that I've defined. Now, the first thing we can look at is the straight line performance, and you can see that in general, McLaren obviously struggling in straight line performances at most circuits. Places where drag don't matter so much, like Monaco, Australia, they've been closer to the rest. Next up, their high-speed cornering performance was lacking until up about Spain. So despite having a relatively high amount of downforce and drag on the car, they haven't been able to extract the performance from it. Arguably, Bahrain and Australia were reasonable, however. Now, it's worth noting that the higher speed the corner is, the less you lose from being a little bit slower through that corner. So for example, 5 kilometers an hour through a high speed corner, you won't lose that much lap time. So this is not such a big deal when we're talking about the high speed corners, but as we get onto it, when you lose 5 kilometers an hour in a medium speed or a low speed corner, you will lose a lot more lap time. The medium speed entries have been mixed, but fairly poor for most of the season. And you can see that they've got enough downforce at some of the circuits. They've been relatively competitive in terms of medium speed apex, even faster than Red Bull in a couple of events. And then in general, the medium speed exits have been okay to slightly poor, but it looks like these are trending to getting better. Now, let's talk about the low speed corners. After the first race in Bahrain, they seem to have made a step in understanding how they need to operate, or at least drive this car with the characteristics that it had. So in Bahrain, they had weak apex and weak exit with a pretty strong entry, which we saw in the telemetry. But after that, they've changed their compromise in how they approach these low speed corners, and they're just giving up a little bit on the entry for relatively competitive apex and exit speeds. Of course, that's not always the case, and some of the exits have been slightly poor, but this will come back to some of their balance problems that we'll talk about in a minute. So as a general summary, I would say their medium speed corner entries and their low speed entries and exits are where probably most of their performance are lacking, with the exception of the straight line, which we'll get back to. So McLaren made some reasonable improvements in the performance of their car and the ability to set up the car leading up to Canada, but their single lap pace was still more than 0.5% off of Red Bull. And they had yet to really convert any of this performance into any meaningful points hauls in the race. By Canada, they were still 6th in the Constructors' Championship, some 17 points behind Alpine in 5th. But in Austria, they found a completely new trajectory. So what changed? Well, to start with, pretty much everything. Without forensically dissecting every photo of the car before and after the upgrade, it's pretty difficult to tell what's changed. But we're in luck. Every time a team introduces an upgrade, they have to declare it, and the FIA document and gather all this information. However, the FIA don't directly publish these changes, but F1 presenter and analyst Albert Fabrega actually shares these with us pretty much every week on Twitter. So if you're not following him right now, you should definitely go and follow him. So here's what this upgrade document looked like in Austria. McLaren pretty much upgraded all of their bodywork around the midsection and rear of the car: side pods, floor, engine cover, and cooling louvers. Now, I'm not an aero guy, but on the surface, the side pod shape has gone a lot further forwards towards Aston Martin's concept, with the deep gullies between the side pod and the engine cover. And the inlets to the side pods look a lot like, well, the Red Bull and the Aston. So from Austria, Norris got a small part of this upgrade package because it came a little bit early, and then more of these components were introduced from Silverstone and then finally in Hungary, and both of them appear to be running the full upgrade package. Now, I'm not an aero guy, I'm not much for looking at the cars and explaining what these things do in terms of performance, but what I'm good at is looking at the data and telling you how the performance has changed and what you need to work on in terms of performance. So what do these upgrades actually do? Let's go back to the data. But first, if you love this kind of analysis, you should definitely check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below. After every qualifying and race session, I boil down and explain all the performance data so that you can understand exactly what happened. This includes qualifying telemetry comparisons and detailed lap breakdowns. It also includes race strategy and pace analysis from races, and I've even added some really cool race starts analysis recently. I'm even going to publish all the data that I used to generate this analysis so you can dive even deeper into McLaren's recovery arc this season, including the graphs here. So again, breaking this down, McLaren really haven't solved their straight line speed issue, but they've been relatively competitive at a few events. But the first thing I want to focus on is McLaren have found huge gains in their high-speed cornering performances. They've even bettered Red Bull in the high-speed corners in Austria and Hungary. Now, the other thing I've noticed is their medium-speed exits have also improved substantially. Corner exits, again, are very important for lap time, as typically you carry this exit speed down the following straight. They've also found a reasonable chunk of performance consistently in the low-speed corner apexes and corner exits, much more than they found earlier in the season. Again, the exits are key because they also translate to straight line performance to some degree as well. However, McLaren are still struggling with their low-speed entries. But to me, the main takeaway from this update package is they have made more use of their downforce. They've alleviated their straight line deficit to some degree at some circuits, which we'll come back to. High-speed cornering performance clearly improved. Medium speeds and low-speed apexes and exits also substantially improved. Now, we mentioned Spa and we kind of glossed over it, but McLaren were pretty much absolutely nowhere in terms of top speed, and this a little bit had them over in terms of their race, in terms of the ability to overtake or defend in the straights. But in terms of the performance characteristics in this analysis, it was a little bit of one of those mixed wet-dry crossover sessions, and the results between the sprint shootout and the actual main qualifying session were a little bit different, so I'm not going to put too much emphasis on this, and we'll wait to see. Now, the obvious thing was it looked like McLaren opted for a wet setup, which looks like a little bit of a rookie mistake. But on the other hand, there are suggestions that McLaren don't actually have a lower downforce configuration which would be suitable for Spa. And the idea being, rather than focus on developing a lower downforce package, they said, you know what, we'll forgo developing this lower downforce rear wing and we'll focus on the rest of the car and reducing drag and improving the characteristics, which realistically that could make sense. I mean, if we go back and we look at the low to medium downforce circuits like Belgium, Canada, Azerbaijan, and Saudi Arabia, this makes sense. They were absolutely nowhere in terms of straight line at these circuits, and these are the kind of circuits where you would put a lower downforce rear wing on. At the other circuits, especially as we come later in the season, it looks like they've rectified their straight line deficit a bit, but only at circuits where this medium to higher level of downforce is applicable. But Monza is coming up. Are they going to develop a lower downforce package, or are they going to kind of keep the car optimized around this medium downforce level and kind of just take the loss at some of these higher efficiency circuits? McLaren might not be overall sorted in terms of their downforce and drag situation, but we still haven't talked so much about their handling characteristics. Now, as far as the handling characteristics go, we have established that their medium speed and low speed entries are pretty weak. And the McLaren drivers even had a couple of interesting comments after the British Grand Prix, and this is when Lando has some of the upgrades on his car already. And it seemed like Lando just felt like the added high-speed performance and reduced drag is responsible for the performance gains. But in terms of the handling characteristics and unpredictability of the MCL60, he feels that the car is only about 30% fixed from these upgrades. So it sounds like they've got a rough idea of what they need to do, but they just need to keep pushing down that direction. But what does that mean? When we talk about characteristics of a Formula 1 car, it's not just about adding stability or removing understeer. A lot of the time, it's a lot more specific than that. The thing is, we're trying to add stability or remove understeer in very specific places. Setup changes like changing the front wing to adjust the aero balance or changing the anti-roll bars to adjust the mechanical balance really only make wholesale changes, and one of them might affect high speed more than the other. But it's really difficult with setup changes to pinpoint something like low speed entry stability. And this is the point where you're just bleeding off the brakes and adding steering, and that window where you need that stability might only be a very small state of the car. We can't do this with global setup changes like springs and bars and toes and camber, but we can change these characteristics with aerodynamic development or long-term chassis development. Unfortunately, changing very specific aero characteristics can take months. So what about McLaren's prospects for the rest of the season? The main question mark that I still have, are McLaren going to invest some resources in developing a lower drag rear wing configuration for the car? Circuits like Monza, Mexico, and Las Vegas will definitely want to be on the higher efficiency or lower drag end of the scale. And on the clearly high downforce circuits like Zandvoort, Singapore, and Interlagos, I think McLaren could be a force to be reckoned with. Honestly, I'm not going to be surprised to see McLaren being quite strong, at least in single lap pace, for the rest of the season. Now, McLaren's race pace and degradation in the last couple of events has actually been quite strong, but I don't see them competing with Red Bull in that arena this season. And depending on how Mercedes, Aston, and Ferrari develop for the rest of the season, McLaren could make another jump in the Constructors' Championship. Now, if you enjoyed this data-driven deep dive into McLaren's performance, I've left a couple of other videos here that I think you'll like, and don't forget to check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description, and I'll see you guys after the summer break.